The letter arrived on a Tuesday, creased perfectly, and sealed with the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association letterhead. That same pretentious gold emblem that had been affixed to every tyrannical notice for the past 3 years. Margaret Holloway held it between 2 fingers as if it might combust, standing in her kitchen while her coffee went cold on the granite countertop. Her hands trembled, but not from fear, from rage. Dear Ms. Holloway, it has come to the attention of the board that you have been maintaining and improving the community pool facility located on your property at 447 Oakwood Drive without proper authorization or consultation. While the pool is situated on your parcel of land, the HOA board has determined that this aquatic amenity constitutes community property as defined in Section 8(4)(c) of the Pine Ridge Estates Governing Covenants. Therefore, all maintenance costs, improvements, and operational decisions regarding said pool must henceforth be approved and funded through HOA channels. Furthermore, the board reserves the right to establish community usage guidelines and scheduling protocols. Failure to comply with this directive may result in fines beginning at $250 per violation, escalating to $500 per month if unresolved. Respectfully, Gerald Hutchins, President, Pine Ridge HOA Board. Margaret read it 3 times, then 4, then she called her lawyer. David Chen had been her attorney for 7 years, since the divorce from Richard. He was sharp, methodical, and most importantly, he didn't bullshit clients. When Margaret arrived at his office that afternoon, still holding the letter in a plastic sleeve like evidence, he read it carefully, made notes, and then sat back in his leather chair with the expression of a man about to deliver bad news. They have a point, he said. Margaret's jaw tightened. They don't have any point, it's my property. It's your property, David agreed, holding up a hand. But look at Section 8(4)(c). I checked the covenant documents when I represented you on the purchase. The language is actually pretty broad. Community amenities, pools, tennis courts, fitness facilities, even if they're physically located on a single residence, can be classified as community property if they're accessible to residents and provide recreational benefit to the association. Accessible, Margaret leaned forward. I have a gate, a locked gate, with a fence I installed myself. The only people who can access it are the people I give the code to. Right, David said, tapping his pen against the desk. And that's your defense, the gate. The fact that it's not freely accessible makes it private property, not community property. But, he held up the pen. They're going to argue that the gate is just a security measure, and the intent of the covenant is that any amenity that could serve the community qualifies as community property. That's insane. That's HOAs. David set down his pen and looked at her directly. Margaret, I can fight this. We can probably win. The language is murky enough that a court would likely side with you. But it's going to cost you. Legal fees, probably $15,000 to $20,000, and they're going to make your life hell in the meantime. Margaret felt something crystallize inside her chest. A kind of cold certainty that she'd come to know well after the divorce. The feeling of being backed into a corner by people who assumed she'd fold. What if I don't fight them? She asked quietly. David blinked. What do you mean? What if I just comply? What if I let them have it? Well, then you'd need to grant them access, agree to let the board manage it, and they'd likely implement some kind of community usage schedule. You'd lose your private pool, essentially. Margaret stood up and walked to his window, which overlooked a busy intersection in downtown Portland. She watched the traffic flow in orderly lines, everyone following the rules, everyone accepting the grid of society that had been drawn for them. What if I surrender it? She said slowly, thinking out loud. What if I say yes, it's community property, and then I charge them for access? David looked confused. I'm sorry. Margaret turned back to him, and there was something in her eyes that made David sit up straighter. If it's community property, then I own it as part of the community. I'm a resident of Pine Ridge Estates. So if it's community property, that means everyone in the community gets equal say in how it's used. And if the community decides to monetize community property, to charge for access permits to maintain the facility, then that's a legitimate community decision. Margaret, David started, but she was already on a roll. You said the letter came from the board. The board doesn't speak for the entire community. They speak for themselves. If I accept their premise that the pool is community property, then I can argue that the community should be consulted on its use. And if I'm implementing a permit system to generate revenue for maintenance and upkeep of said community property, well, that's a perfectly reasonable community decision. David's expression shifted. He wasn't quite smiling, but something in his face suggested he was following her logic and liking it. You'd be exploiting the ambiguity, he said. I'd be following the rules they created, Margaret corrected. They want the pool to be community property? Fine, now everyone pays. The next morning, Margaret got out her measuring tape and her cordless drill. She'd purchased the materials the night before from Home Depot: industrial-grade aluminum, professional signage supplies, UV-resistant vinyl, and a weatherproof permit sheet template she'd found on Amazon. The gate, which had always been locked anyway, now became official. She created a laminated sign. Pine Ridge Community Pool. Daily access permits required. $50 per day, $200 per month. Permits validate parking and pool amenities. For information, call Margaret Holloway 503-550-5014. She photographed it, texted the photo to David with a simple message, "Am I breaking any laws?" and waited. His response came back within an hour. Actually, no. If the board won't provide guidelines or usage policies for community property, and if you're a resident attempting to maintain the facility through cost sharing, this is defensible. Aggressive, but defensible. They'll hate it, though. Margaret smiled for the first time in days. She hadn't expected the phone to start ringing that afternoon. The first call was from Susan DeMarco, who lived 2 streets over and whose teenage daughter had been using the pool all summer. "What is this?" Susan demanded. "We're not paying to use a pool in our own neighborhood." "It's community property now," Margaret said pleasantly. "According to the HOA board, so I'm implementing a community usage fee to help with maintenance and utilities." "This is ridiculous. I'm calling Gerald Hutchins." Margaret waited exactly 17 minutes before Gerald Hutchins himself called. His voice was tight, controlled, the tone of a man who'd rehearsed his words. "Ms. Holloway, this is completely unacceptable. The HOA board has designated the pool as community property, which means it belongs to all of us," Margaret interrupted. "I'm aware, so I'm charging fairly for its use. I assure you the rates are competitive with community pools throughout the Portland metro area, $50 for a daily permit or $200 for unlimited monthly access. I'm also offering family plans at $300 per month. You can't just, we didn't authorize this. And I didn't authorize the HOA board to declare my private property to be community property," Margaret said evenly. "Yet here we are. Apparently authorization isn't required when someone else makes the rules. I'm just following the precedent the board established." There was a long silence. "I'll be consulting with our lawyer," Gerald said finally. "Wonderful," Margaret replied. "Have him reference Section 8(4)(c). I'll be waiting." She hung up, and then she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and waited for the chaos to begin. It didn't take long. By evening, the neighborhood Facebook group had exploded. Messages were flying like ammunition. "Is this legal? She's extorting us. The nerve of this woman. Has anyone contacted their lawyer?" This is exactly why HOAs exist, to prevent this kind of behavior. But there were also, scattered among the fury, other voices. "Wait, didn't the board just declare it community property? How is she wrong? This is actually kind of brilliant. I mean, if it is community property, shouldn't the community have approved how it's managed?" Margaret read the comments with a small smile on her face. She screenshotted the ones supporting her and sent them to David with a thumbs-up emoji. The board met that evening, emergency session. She wasn't invited, but she didn't need to be. The news reached her through the neighborhood grapevine within 2 hours. A mutual acquaintance who sat on the board's architectural committee mentioned, casually at the grocery store, that Gerald was absolutely apoplectic. The thing about people like Gerald Hutchins, Margaret had learned, was that they understood power in only one direction. They understood them having it. The moment someone else picked up the same rules and weaponized them back, they were genuinely baffled. It was like watching someone discover that the sword they'd been using to cut others could also cut them. At 9 p.m., her doorbell rang. Margaret had been expecting this. She'd prepared mentally for it, the way she'd learned to prepare for difficult conversations during the divorce. She opened the door to find Gerald Hutchins himself standing on her porch, along with two other board members, Patricia Weston, who ran the architectural committee with iron-fisted precision, and Tom Blackwell, who owned a property management company and always voted in favor of stricter enforcement. Gerald did not look well. His face was flushed, his jaw clenched so tightly she could see his temples working. "This ends," he said without preamble. "Tonight, you remove that sign, you rescind this nonsense, and we move forward." "Move forward with what exactly?" Margaret asked, remaining in the doorway, not inviting them in. "Shall I just give the community free access to my property again? Let anyone use my pool, my utilities, wear and tear on my landscaping, all without permission or coordination?" "It's not your property," Patricia said sharply. "That's what the board decided." "Then the board needs to decide how it's managed," Margaret replied. "And since I'm a community member and I own part of this community property, I have every right to propose a usage and revenue model. If the board disagrees, they can hold a vote with the entire neighborhood. Let's see what everyone thinks." Tom Blackwell's eyes narrowed. He was the only one Margaret noticed who actually seemed to be thinking rather than just reacting. "You're not going to back down on this," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," Margaret confirmed. "I'm not, but I'm also not asking for anything unreasonable. I'm maintaining the pool, I'm installing new filters, I'm paying for chemicals, electricity, insurance. I'm implementing a professional permit system with clear terms of service. The fees cover actual costs plus a reasonable maintenance reserve. If the board wants to take over all of those responsibilities, they're welcome to. But I suspect their idea of management doesn't include actually spending board funds." Gerald's face somehow got even redder. "We'll have you in court by Monday." "For what?" Margaret asked calmly. "Charging a fee for access to community property that I maintain. Go ahead, Gerald. Explain to a judge why I should be paying entirely out of pocket to operate a community amenity." He turned and walked away, Patricia following, shaking her head. Tom lingered for a moment, studying Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That was gutsy," he said finally. "That was legal," Margaret corrected. Tom smiled, not a kind smile, but a smile nonetheless. "Same thing sometimes." He turned and left. Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, her heart hammering, but she wasn't afraid. She was alive in a way she hadn't been in years. She had found a problem and fashioned a solution. She had used their own rules against them. She had drawn a line. And tomorrow, she thought, she would start selling permits. The first person to buy a permit showed up at 8 a.m. the next morning. It was not someone from the neighborhood. It was a woman named Jennifer, who pulled up in a Honda Civic with two kids in the back seat and asked breathlessly, "Is this the pool where you don't need to be a resident?" Margaret, still in her coffee-stained robe, realized suddenly that this wasn't just a neighborhood matter anymore. "Where did you find out about the pool?" she asked. "I posted about it on the Mom Facebook group," Jennifer said. "I said my neighbor was charging to use a private pool and like everyone wanted to know where. My kids have been on a wait list for the community pool all summer. We live 20 minutes away. If I can come here for $50 a day, that's actually cheaper than the membership at the Y for the whole month." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a deeper realization settling in, heavy and consequential. By that afternoon, she had sold permits to 15 people. By the end of the week, she was running a waiting list. And somewhere in the HOA board office, Gerald Hutchins was discovering that his attempt to control Margaret Holloway had just opened a floodgate he had no idea how to close. The real war, Margaret understood now, was only just beginning. By week 2, Margaret had generated $3,200 in permit revenue. She'd invested in a clipboard system, a laminated booking sheet that lived in a weatherproof lockbox by the gate, and a spreadsheet where she meticulously tracked every transaction. More importantly, she'd established rules. Daily permits valid 10 a.m., 6 p.m. Monthly permits allow unlimited access. Residents receive 20% discount. Groups of 8+ require advance notice. Pool closed Tuesdays for maintenance. No glass, no pits, no outside alcohol. It was professional. It was systematic. It was exactly what the HOA board should have done if they actually wanted to manage community property properly. Which made it worse for them. The board's lawyer, a woman named Catherine Yee who worked out of a downtown firm, sent a formal cease and desist letter on Friday afternoon. David called Margaret before the document even landed in her inbox, warning her it was coming. "They're claiming unlicensed commercial operation on residential property," David said. "They're arguing you're running a business without permits, without proper zoning approval, without, get this, proper liability insurance." Margaret felt her stomach drop for the first time since this had started. "I didn't think about insurance." "Don't panic, it's actually easy to get. Business liability, pool-specific coverage, all online in about an hour. Cost is minimal. And here's the thing, the moment you're properly insured, their entire commercial operation argument falls apart. Because you're not running a business, you're managing community property with a cost recovery model." But the cease and desist hit harder than Margaret expected, not because it was legally threatening, but because of what it represented. A professional response. The board had finally stopped being reactive and started being strategic. That night, Margaret sat at her laptop and researched liability insurance for pool facilities. She found a policy that was actually cheaper than she expected, added herself as the operator of a community recreational facility, and completed the purchase within 90 minutes. She uploaded the certificate of insurance to a cloud folder, ready to share with David. She was just closing her laptop when her phone rang. It was Susan DeMarco. "Hi, Margaret," Susan said, her voice careful, measured. "I'm calling because I have a proposal for you, and I want you to listen before you say no." Margaret's first instinct was to refuse, but something in Susan's tone, something almost conspiratorial, made her pause. "I'm listening. Several of us from the neighborhood have been talking about the pool, about what's happening with the board, and we realized something. You're actually right about this situation being absurd." "I appreciate that," Margaret said cautiously. "Here's what we're thinking. The board is going to fight you. They're going to spend money on lawyers, and you're going to spend money on lawyers, and it's all going to be exhausting and expensive. Or," Susan paused, "or you could sell us the pool." Margaret didn't say anything. "Not the physical property," Susan continued quickly. "Your land stays yours, but you could deed the pool facility itself to a community trust. Form a nonprofit, make yourself the executor, and then charge membership fees directly through that nonprofit. That way, everything is above board, everything is legal, and the board loses their leverage because there's nothing for them to legally challenge." Margaret's mind raced. It was elegant, it was brilliant. It was also not at all what she'd been planning. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "Why would you want to help me?" "Because," Susan said, "honestly, we're tired of Gerald Hutchins. We're tired of Patricia Weston deciding what our lives should look like. We're tired of the constant fines and the rules and the attitude that the board knows better. And you found a way to not just refuse to accept it, but to make them bend. And we think it's time some of them bent a little more." There was a beat of silence. "I need to think about it," Margaret said finally. "Don't think too long," Susan replied. "The board's special meeting is Wednesday. They're going to vote to levy a $500 monthly fine against you for operating an unlicensed commercial venture. If we're going to move on this nonprofit idea, we need to move before that vote." Susan hung up, and Margaret sat in the darkness of her living room, the weight of choice pressing down on her shoulders. She met with David the next morning. He listened to Susan's proposal while Margaret paced his office like a caged animal. "It's not a bad idea," he said when she finished. "The nonprofit trust framework protects you from personal liability, gives the board nothing to sue, and lets you operate in perpetuity. But it also means you're giving up something." "Control," Margaret said. "Autonomy," David corrected. "Once you formalize a nonprofit, there are bylaws, there are protocols, there are other people involved. You can't just decide on a whim to raise prices or change policies. There's process. There's democracy, essentially." Which is what Susan said they wanted. "And do you want that, or do you want this to be yours?" Margaret stopped packing. The question hung in the air between them, more personal than legal. "I don't know," she admitted. David leaned back in his chair. "Then let me tell you what happens if you don't do this. The board votes to fine you. You fight it. Litigation drags on for months. They find more reasons to fine you. Neighbors start choosing sides. Some people hate you, some people love you, and everyone's uncomfortable. Eventually, you win. I think you'd win, legally, but the victory comes after a year of warfare. And then what? You have a pool you've defended, but you have a neighborhood that's fractured. And the board has a whole list of new rules about commercial operations on residential property. that they're going to enforce going forward. Versus you legitimize the operation, bring everyone into the fold, and you get to keep doing what you're doing with the explicit backing of the community. The board can't touch you because the pool will belong to a nonprofit entity that includes neighborhood residents in governance. The threat disappears. But so does my victory, Margaret said quietly. It's not about me winning anymore, it's about all of us. Exactly, David said. And the question is that better or worse? The nonprofit formation took 5 days. Margaret and Susan, working with David as legal advisor, created Pine Ridge Community Pools, LLC, a charitable organization dedicated to providing affordable recreational access to the local area. They established a board of governors, 7 people, Margaret, pool operation, Susan, community liaison, Tom Blackwell from the HOA, who had quietly agreed to join them, 2 other neighborhood residents, a CPA to manage finances, and a retired educator who specialized in nonprofit governance. They scheduled the first official meeting for Thursday evening. The HOA board had scheduled their special meeting for Wednesday night, the one where they'd planned to vote on the $500 monthly fine. Gerald didn't know what hit him. Margaret wasn't present for the Wednesday meeting. She watched the Facebook group blow up in real time instead. Within minutes of the meeting starting, posts began appearing. Did you guys hear? There's going to be a nonprofit pool. What? The board doesn't know about this. Margaret just announced it in an email to the whole neighborhood. The board is losing it, lol. What had actually happened was that Susan, using her position as the neighborhood coordinator for the community email list, had sent out an official announcement. Dear Pine Ridge residents, we are pleased to announce the formation of Pine Ridge Community Pools, LLC, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing affordable and professionally maintained swimming access to Pine Ridge Estates residents and our greater community. Our nonprofit structure ensures that all operational decisions are made through a transparent governance model, and that all revenue is reinvested directly into facility maintenance, improvements, and programming. Membership rates will remain competitive and community-focused. Founding members enjoy a lifetime 20% discount. The inaugural Board of Governors meeting will be held Thursday at 7 p.m. at the facility. All residents are welcome to attend. We look forward to serving you. Susan DeMarco, Nonprofit Community Liaison. And there, buried in the signatures at the bottom of the email, was Tom Blackwell's name. Tom Blackwell from the HOA. Tom Blackwell, who'd called Margaret's move gutsy and smiled that predatory smile. Tom Blackwell, who'd apparently decided that he liked the direction this was going better than he liked the board's. Gerald's response email went out 40 minutes later, and it was frantic. This nonprofit has not been approved by the HOA board and does not represent the official position of Pine Ridge Estates. The board does not recognize this organization's claim to the pool facility. Residents are advised to direct all inquiries to the board. But the damage was done. 47 households had already expressed interest in the nonprofit membership. 12 had pledged founding member status. The announcement, in combining legitimacy, nonprofit, community interest, discovery of neighbors who shared the frustration with the board, and perfect timing, just before the board's vote, had transformed the narrative completely. By the time the board voted on the $500 fine, it didn't matter anymore. They were voting on a phantom problem. The pool was no longer Margaret's private venture charging for community property. The pool was community property, managed by the community for the community. And Margaret sat on the board that ran it. The first official Board of Governors meeting was held in Margaret's living room. The nonprofit wasn't yet incorporated enough to have its own space. 7 people sat around her dining table, sipping coffee and examining the first month's financial reports. The numbers were impressive: $8,900 in revenue from permits and memberships, $2,100 in expenses, chemicals, insurance, filter replacement, a healthy margin. Where does the surplus go? The CPA asked, pen poised over his notebook. Capital improvements, Margaret said. The filter system is from 2015. We need to replace it. The concrete around the deck is cracking. There's damage to the decking boards. If we're operating as a community facility, we need to maintain it like one. And after capital improvements are covered? The retired educator, whose name was Linda, asked. Margaret glanced at Susan, then at Tom. Programming, she said. I've been thinking about this. We could offer swim lessons for kids who can't afford them otherwise. We could do community events, water aerobics for seniors, family nights, that kind of thing. We could genuinely make this something that serves the neighborhood. There was quiet consideration around the table. That's a very different vision than what you started with, Linda said gently. I know, Margaret admitted. I started with anger. I'm trying to end with something useful. Tom smiled that same smile. That's growth. The HOA board's response came a week later. They didn't fight the nonprofit directly. Instead, they announced a new community project, an official community pool to be built on common ground, professionally managed through the HOA structure. It's desperate, David said when he called to brief Margaret. They're trying to make your nonprofit irrelevant by creating competition. Problem is, it's going to cost them $300,000 in startup costs plus annual operational expenses. And I guarantee you their budget doesn't have that kind of cushion. He was right. 6 weeks later, the board announced they were tabling the project pending a vote on whether to assess each household $400 to fund the new facility. The assessment failed. 62% of residents voted against it. Margaret suspected they were already happy with what they had. By the end of summer, Pine Ridge Community Pools had 152 active memberships. The pool had been resurfaced. The filter system had been replaced. Margaret had hired a part-time maintenance technician and was offering beginner swim lessons on Saturday mornings. Gerald Hutchins's term on the HOA board ended in October. He didn't run for re-election. Patricia Weston followed him 6 months later, citing personal reasons. By the following summer, Tom Blackwell had been voted in as the new board president. His first official act was to request a meeting with the nonprofit's board. I want to propose a formal partnership, he said, sitting in the same living room where Margaret's dining table hosted the nonprofit meetings. The HOA recognizes Pine Ridge Community Pools as the official recreational facility for the neighborhood. In exchange, residents get automatic membership at a community rate, and the HOA commits to funding major maintenance from the budget reserve. Margaret, Susan, and Linda exchanged glances. What's the catch? Margaret asked. No catch, Tom said. Just politics. I got tired of being on the wrong side of things. And so, by the following summer, Margaret's angry defiance had transformed into something else entirely. A legitimate nonprofit, a well-maintained facility, a genuine community resource. She'd won by surrendering. She'd changed the system by accepting it and then demanding it be better. The twist was that nobody, not even Margaret, had expected that to be possible. On the morning 1 year after the first permit was sold, Margaret stood at the gate of the pool facility with Susan and Tom, watching a group of 8-year-olds participate in the nonprofit's free swim lesson program. One of the children broke from the group, swimming powerfully toward the deep end. That's Marcus, Susan said quietly. He's the DeMarco's son. He was terrified of water last summer. Now look at him. Margaret watched the boy move through the water, his confidence absolute. We did that, Susan said. You did that. Margaret didn't respond. She was thinking about how anger had led her here, to a place of genuine community purpose, about how spite, properly directed, could sometimes transform into legacy. But she was also thinking about what came next. Because the story wasn't over yet. It was only shifting into a new shape. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in late September, and this time it didn't come from the HOA. It came from Richard Holloway's lawyer. Margaret held the envelope with a strange mixture of dread and resignation. She'd known in some deep part of herself that this was coming, that she'd been too visible, too successful, too publicly vindicated, that her ex-husband, who'd made his fortune in real estate development and spent their marriage treating people as obstacles to be overcome, would eventually notice. David's voice on the phone that afternoon was carefully controlled. He's filing a claim, David said without preamble. Asset division. He's arguing that the pool facility, as an improvement made during the marriage and substantially increased in value through your operational efforts, constitutes marital property that was not properly accounted for in the original divorce settlement. Margaret felt the world tilt slightly, But I bought the house after the divorce. The pool was installed after the divorce. Which is his problem technically, David said. But the claim isn't really about the pool. It's about the nonprofit structure and the value you've created. He's arguing that the business operation, the nonprofit, the membership fees, the revenue stream, that's what he's after. He's claiming you've been generating income from an enterprise that should have been disclosed and factored into alimony calculations. I'm not paying him alimony. Exactly, which is why he's coming at it sideways. He's claiming you should have been, based on the income generated from this pool operation. Margaret sat down hard on her kitchen chair. How much is he asking for? There was a pause. $80,000 plus retroactive alimony adjustment. The number hung in the air between them like a physical thing. He can't do that, Margaret said, but she heard the uncertainty in her own voice. He can and he has, David said. Look, it's not completely frivolous. You did generate significant income. The nonprofit structure creates some ambiguity about whether that's personal income subject to alimony or organizational income. It's not a strong case, but it's not completely without merit. We'll win, but we'll have to fight. How much will that cost? 30 to 40,000, maybe more if he escalates. Margaret closed her eyes. She'd been so focused on the pool, on building something, that she hadn't considered this vulnerability. Of course, Richard would come for her. He'd always understood one fundamental truth about Margaret. She couldn't resist a fight. And he had the resources to make that fight impossibly expensive. The thing about Richard was that he didn't hate Margaret. Hate would have been simpler. Instead, he was genuinely convinced that he was the victim of an unfair divorce settlement, despite the fact that the settlement had been reviewed by both lawyers and approved by the judge. He believed, with the absolute certainty of someone who'd never been told no and actually had to accept it, that Margaret had gotten lucky, and he deserved another chance to correct the injustice. They'd been married for 15 years. She'd supported his early business ventures while he built his real estate development company. She'd raised their daughter Emma, now 19 and in college, mercifully far from the conflict. She'd managed the household, the logistics, the emotional labor of keeping a family intact while Richard worked 80-hour weeks and, unbeknownst to her for most of their marriage, spent Saturday afternoons with his assistant in hotel rooms downtown. When she'd found out she'd been 42 years old, she'd been married 15 years, she'd been utterly unprepared to be alone. But she'd learned. The divorce had been amicable on the surface. They'd agreed on most things, divided assets relatively evenly, worked out custody of Emma, who'd been 14 at the time. Richard had paid child support, would continue to do so until Emma turned 18, which had now happened. The settlement had been clean enough. Apparently, though, Richard had decided that clean meant undervalued. Margaret met with David again 3 days later. He'd prepared a brief counterargument, though his expression suggested he wasn't optimistic. The problem, he said, walking her through the documents, is that the nonprofit is generating substantial revenue. It's not enormous. We're talking about $120,000 annual income, which is actually quite modest for a nonprofit operation. But it's not negligible either. And the nonprofit was formed using the pool facility, which is located on your property, as its primary asset. But it's a nonprofit, Margaret protested. The money doesn't go to me. It goes back into operations and community programming. Which is legally correct and morally defensible, David agreed. But Richard's argument is that you structured it this way specifically to avoid alimony obligations, that you took what could have been personal income and funneled it into an organizational structure that shields it from his claims. That's insane. I did it because it was the right thing to do. I did it to help the community. I believe you, David said, and a court will probably believe you. But here's the thing, Richard doesn't have to win. He just has to make this expensive and painful enough that you agree to settle. That's his actual goal, not justice. Leverage. Margaret felt something harden in her chest. She recognized this dynamic. This was the weaponization of time and money. This was an older, wealthier man deciding that fairness was negotiable. What if I refuse to settle? She asked. Then we go to trial. We argue that the nonprofit is a separate legal entity from you as an individual. We argue that the revenue is not your personal income. We argue that he's trying to double dip on an already finalized settlement. We probably win, but we spend $40,000 to do it. And if I settle? That depends on what he's willing to accept. He's asking for 80 grand plus retroactive adjustment. He might settle for 40 or 50, but any settlement is an admission that he has some claim, and that creates precedent. Margaret stood and walked to David's window again. From the 11th floor of his downtown office building, she could see the city spread out below her, all those thousands of lives, all those individual struggles and victories and daily dramas. Richard somewhere down there in his expensive office, probably thinking he'd calculated everything perfectly, probably certain of the outcome. "Fight him," she said. David didn't look surprised. "Okay, but Margaret, I need you to understand what that means. He's going to subpoena your records. He's going to depose you. He's going to try to prove that you intentionally created a nonprofit structure to hide income. He's going to make you look calculating and vindictive. And if you lose—" "I won't lose." "If you lose," David continued firmly, "you could owe him substantially more than 80,000. Court costs, penalties, all of it. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret turned back to him. She thought about Richard, sitting in his office, convinced that money was the ultimate argument. She thought about the pool, about the community that had formed around it, about the freedom she'd claimed for herself by refusing to accept what the world told her she should accept. She thought about the difference between fighting because you were angry and fighting because you couldn't afford not to. "Yes," she said, "I'm prepared." The discovery process began immediately. Richard's lawyer, a shark named Morrison who'd made a career out of contentious divorces, subpoenaed everything. The nonprofit's financial records, Margaret's personal tax returns for the past 5 years, emails, text messages, meeting minutes. Everything. David had warned her that this would be brutal. He hadn't mentioned how humiliating it would be. Margaret spent a Tuesday afternoon in David's conference room while Morrison deposed her, Morrison's associate recording every word. The questions came like attacks. "Isn't it true that you received notification that the pool was classified as community property? And your response was to immediately implement a commercial fee structure. You didn't consult the board. You didn't involve the HOA. You unilaterally decided to monetize property you knew was designated as community property, correct? When you formed the nonprofit, you installed yourself as the primary operator and retained all operational decision-making authority. Isn't that right? The nonprofit has generated approximately $120,000 in annual revenue. Can you identify where the vast majority of that revenue comes from?" Margaret answered each question carefully, but she could see where this was going. Morrison was building a narrative. Margaret as a calculating businesswoman who'd seen an opportunity and seized it, then hidden behind a nonprofit structure when challenged. It was a warped version of the truth, but it contained just enough truth to feel dangerous. Susan called Margaret that evening. "Tom told me Richard filed suit," Susan said without preamble. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough," Margaret replied. She didn't want to talk about it. She wanted to pretend it wasn't happening, that this was just another obstacle that would eventually resolve. "We're going to help you," Susan said. "The neighborhood. We're going to testify if it comes to that. We're going to tell the court that the nonprofit is real, that the community actually cares about it, that it's not just a shell for you to hide money." "You don't have to do that," Margaret said. "This isn't your fight." "It became our fight the moment Richard decided to attack you for doing something good," Susan said firmly. "We have his number, Margaret. Richard comes from money. He assumes that everyone operates the way he does, calculating, self-interested, using the rules as weapons. He can't understand that you actually gave a shit, that you built something real. And he's coming after you because he's terrified of that. He's terrified that you've become someone powerful without him." After Margaret hung up, she sat in the darkness of her living room and let Susan's words settle. She was right. Richard couldn't understand generosity because he'd never experienced it. He couldn't understand commitment to community because he'd always viewed community as a hierarchy to climb. He couldn't understand growth that didn't translate to wealth or status. And so he was trying the only language he understood: force, money, legal pressure. The question was whether Margaret would respond in the same language. The depositions continued for 3 weeks. David deposed Richard, who remained calm and lawyerly, producing financial records showing his substantial income and claiming his current alimony burden, which was already generous by most standards, was somehow disproportionate to Margaret's improved circumstances. Morrison deposed Tom, Susan, and 3 other nonprofit board members. He tried to establish that the nonprofit was a front, a cover operation, a way for Margaret to hide assets. But instead, he got testimony about community impact, about children learning to swim, about funding mechanisms and transparent governance, about how Margaret had transformed from being defensive about her pool to genuinely leading an organization dedicated to serving others. It didn't fit the narrative Morrison was trying to build. 2 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, David called Margaret with news. "Richard wants to talk," he said. "His lawyer reached out to me. They're willing to negotiate." "What's the ask?" "30,000. One payment, final settlement, full release." Margaret did the math. 30,000 would deplete most of her savings. 30,000 would be a meaningful financial hit. But 30,000 was also half what Richard had originally asked for and significantly less than what this trial was going to cost in legal fees. "I want a counteroffer," Margaret said. David paused. "What did you have in mind?" 15,000. And he has to issue a public statement that the nonprofit is a legitimate community organization and he fully supports its mission. David actually laughed. "Margaret, that's not going to happen." "Call him," Margaret said. "Tell him 15,000 and a statement. Or tell him I'll see him at trial, and I'll spend the next 6 months making sure every journalist in Portland understands exactly what he's doing, trying to claim income from a charitable nonprofit that serves his ex-wife's community. Tell him we can settle like adults, or we can make him a news story." There was a long silence. "That's a threat," David said finally. "It's leverage," Margaret corrected. "Isn't that what he's been doing this whole time?" Richard settled for 25,000, no public statement. Margaret felt the financial impact acutely. It was a significant sum. But she also felt something else, the recognition that she'd refused to be bullied into submission. She'd met his force with her own form of pressure, and they'd come to terms. It wasn't victory exactly. It was something more complicated. It was the acknowledgement that she'd built something real, something worth fighting for, something that Richard himself, for all his money and power, couldn't actually take away. The nonprofit continued, the pool continued, the community continued. And Margaret, for the first time since the divorce, felt something like genuine peace. Not the absence of struggle, but the knowledge that she could survive struggle, that she could face down people who meant her harm, that she could build something that mattered even when the world told her she should just collect her settlement and fade away. On the day Margaret made the final payment to Richard, Tom Blackwell called with a new proposal. "We want to expand," Tom said. "Build a second facility on common ground, create a full recreation complex, and we want you to run it." Margaret listened, but she was thinking about the cost, about how much of herself this was already consuming, about whether there was a limit to how much you could give before you started losing what you'd been fighting to preserve. "Let me think about it," she said. But she already knew the answer. It was time to stop fighting. It was time to figure out what peace looked like. Part 4, The Reckoning. By October of the second year, Pine Ridge Community Pools had become something neither Margaret nor Susan nor even Tom had anticipated. It wasn't just a pool anymore. It had become a kind of local landmark, the place where things were done right, where community actually meant something concrete rather than just a word attached to homeowners associations and parking restrictions. The nonprofit had expanded its programming. Swim lessons, yes, but also aquatic therapy for seniors, water polo leagues for teenagers, synchronized swimming demonstrations, private party rentals, and something Susan had called community swim nights. Free access one evening a week for neighborhood residents to just be together. The facility had become, improbably, a gathering place. But Margaret was tired. She was standing at the pool's edge on a Wednesday afternoon, watching the 2 p.m. senior water aerobics class. 16 women ranging in age from 63 to 87, moving through the water with varying degrees of capability but uniform expressions of joy. When she realized she had become responsible for their joy. That wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but it was a thing, and things had weight. She was pulled from her reverie by her phone buzzing. A text from Emma, her daughter, who was in her sophomore year at Reed College up in Portland. "Mom, you missed my call yesterday. Everything okay?" Margaret hadn't missed the call. She'd been too busy coordinating with the pool maintenance company about the resurfacing of the deep end. She'd let it go to voicemail and had meant to call back. Emma had left a message. Hey, Mom, just wanted to talk about Thanksgiving break. Hope you're not too busy with your pool empire. Pool empire? That's what Emma called it, half joking, half accusatory. Margaret texted back, sorry, long day. Can we video call tonight? She knew what Emma wanted to talk about. Emma, who'd been 14 when Margaret had gone through the divorce, who'd watched her mother transform from passive to aggressive, from accepting to defiant. Emma, who was now old enough to see that transformation from multiple angles and was probably wondering if it had been worth it. Margaret was beginning to wonder too. The video call came at 8 p.m. Emma appeared on Margaret's laptop screen from her dorm room, surrounded by the controlled chaos of college life, books stacked on the dresser, a half-drunk coffee cup, a poster for a concert that had probably already happened. Emma was her father's daughter in many ways, sharp-featured, ambitious, quick to assess situations and find leverage points. But she had Margaret's stubbornness, which meant she rarely let things go. So, Emma said, how are you actually doing? The question was simple enough, but Margaret understood what it really was. Permission to be honest. I'm tired, Margaret admitted. It's not bad tired, but it's real. I'm at the pool most days. I'm in meetings with the nonprofit board. I'm dealing with maintenance emergencies, programming decisions, budget reviews. It's a job. It's just a job I never realized I'd committed to. Do you regret it? Emma asked. Margaret considered the question. No, but I regret not thinking far enough ahead to understand what I was signing up for. I thought I was fighting for something. I didn't realize I was signing up to be responsible for it long term. Emma nodded. She was silent for a moment, processing. Dad's been trying to tell me that you're being unreasonable, that you took something you had no right to monetize and then acted like a martyr when he called you on it, that you've turned into this person who can't just let things be simple. That's not fair, Margaret said, but even as she said it, she understood why Richard would frame it that way. He would never understand that there wasn't a simple version available. That simplicity was a privilege she'd never been granted, not really. I know, Emma said. I told him that. I also told him that you're kind of a badass, that I've watched you build something real, that I might not understand all of it, but I see that it matters to you. Margaret felt something tight in her chest release slightly. Do you think it was worth it, all the fighting? I think you're asking the wrong question, Emma said. The question isn't whether fighting was worth it. The question is whether you're happy, and I'm not sure you are. I'm not sure you've been happy since the divorce ended. I think you've been on crusade. After they hung up, Margaret sat in her living room in the darkness and let Emma's words settle. On crusade, that was exactly right. She'd spent 2 years proving something, to the HOA board, to Richard, to herself, and she'd won. But winning had come at a cost she was only now beginning to calculate. She'd lost flexibility. She'd lost the ability to just step away, to let someone else manage the pool if she wanted to. She'd lost the option of being selfish, because the community was counting on her. She'd built something so good that it had become a cage of her own design. The phone rang at 10 p.m. It was Susan. We have a problem, Susan said without preamble. Margaret's heart sank. What kind of problem? The city is threatening to shut us down. Why, we have all our permits, we have liability insurance, we're in full compliance with. Technically compliant doesn't matter, Susan interrupted. There's a city ordinance that regulates private recreational facilities. Someone, I'm betting Gerald, though I can't prove it, filed a complaint saying we're operating an unlicensed commercial pool facility. The city's interpretation is that nonprofit doesn't exempt us from zoning regulations. Susan, it's been 2 years. Why are they coming after us now? Because someone pushed them to, Susan said. And I'd bet money that someone is wearing an HOA pin right now, probably at Patricia Weston's house, probably over cocktails, probably talking about how our commercial operation is affecting the neighborhood character. Margaret felt the crusade not ending but transforming. A new enemy, a new battle, and she realized with a kind of tired certainty that there would always be new enemies. There would always be new obstacles. There would always be people who found her existence, her success, her community, her refusal to accept their version of how things should be, to be threatening. And she was tired of fighting. What if we don't? Margaret said. Don't what? Susan asked. What if we don't fight this? What if we just close the pool? There was silence on the other end. Margaret, you can't be serious. Why not? Margaret said. It wasn't rhetorical, it was a genuine question. I built this to prove something. I've proved it. The community has the nonprofit structure. The pool is maintained. We could transfer operation to someone else. The city wants us closed. Fine, we close. But Susan started. The point was never the pool, Margaret continued. The point was that I could do something impossible when I decided to try. The point was that I wasn't going to be controlled by people who thought they had power over me. I've proven all of that. I've won that argument, and I don't need to keep proving it for the rest of my life. Margaret, Susan said slowly, the whole neighborhood will be devastated. The neighborhood will survive, Margaret said. They survived before the pool. They can survive after. And you know what? I think you could run this better than I can anyway. You actually like organizing things. I just like winning fights. This is not about the pool, Susan said. It wasn't a question. No, Margaret agreed. It's not. I need to step back. I need to have a life that isn't about proving something to Richard or the HOA or my ex or anyone else. I need to just be. It took 2 weeks to transition Margaret out of her operational role. She remained on the nonprofit board. She wasn't abandoning it completely, but she stepped down as the day-to-day facility manager. Susan accepted the position, and Tom brought in his property management company to handle ongoing maintenance. They established protocols, created manuals, built systems that didn't depend on any one person's effort. By mid-November, the pool was running smoothly without Margaret's constant attention for the first time in 2 years. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. She accepted the city's citation, responded through proper channels, and agreed to work with both the city and the HOA to establish compliant operational standards. It took 6 months, but they eventually reached a compromise. The nonprofit could continue operating, but with specific zoning designations, operational hours, and community engagement protocols. It was the kind of reasonable solution that never would have been reached if Margaret had been fighting. The kind of answer that required surrendering control first. In the process of surrendering, she discovered, she'd actually maintained more influence than she would have through continued struggle. The anniversary party was held on a Saturday in June, 3 years after Margaret had first posted the permit signs on her gate. The entire neighborhood was invited. The pool complex had been decorated with strings of lights. There was a catering company providing food. Tom gave a speech about community resilience. Susan gave a speech about Margaret's vision. Half a dozen people Margaret barely remembered gave testimonies about what the pool had meant to them. And Margaret, standing in the back of the crowd, felt something unexpected. Gratitude, not for the battle itself, but for what had been built from it, for the genuine community that had formed, for the friendships, for the knowledge that she'd created something that would outlast her anger. Emma appeared at her elbow, home from college for the summer. "You're not fighting anymore?" Emma observed. "No," Margaret agreed, "I'm not." "Are you happy?" Margaret thought about it. "I'm at peace. That's different from happy. Happy is too small. I'm at peace." They stood together, mother and daughter, watching the community they'd been at war for transform into something organic and self-sustaining. "I'm proud of you," Emma said. "I wanted to tell you that." Margaret put her arm around her daughter and held her while the sun set over the pool, turning the water to liquid gold. 3 months later, Margaret accepted an offer to serve on the city's Parks and Recreation Advisory Board. Not because she felt obligated to fight anymore, but because she developed genuine expertise in community engagement and recreational programming. She could help others build what she'd built. It was work, but it was work that felt like contribution rather than combat. And in the evenings, she spent time with friends. She started reading again. She took a pottery class with Susan. She went out on a few dates with a man she'd met at the community center, a retired teacher named James who understood the difference between principle and vendetta. She had finally become someone who was living, rather than someone who was proving. But the story, as it turned out, wasn't quite finished yet. Because Richard, observing her transformation from afar, had begun to do some transforming of his own. Richard Holloway filed the second lawsuit on a Thursday morning, and this time his lawyer's letter didn't accuse Margaret of anything. It was dated January 15, 2026, and it contained 3 words that Margaret had never expected to read in legal correspondence from her ex-husband. Request for modification. David's voice on the phone was cautious. He wants to talk, not through lawyers, in person. He asked if you'd be willing to meet him for coffee. Is this a trick? Margaret asked. I don't think so, David said. But I don't know what he wants. You don't have to do this. I'll meet him, Margaret said. She'd grown confident enough that she didn't fear conversation anymore. She wasn't worried about being manipulated into something she didn't want. She was merely curious about what had prompted Richard, 3 years after the initial settlement, to suddenly want direct contact. They met at a coffee shop downtown on neutral territory. Richard looked older than Margaret remembered, not physically, but in the way he carried himself. Some of the certainty had drained from his face, replaced by something she didn't immediately recognize. They ordered coffee. They sat at a corner table. And Richard, who'd never been good at small talk and worse at apologies, launched directly into explanation. I sold the development company, he said. Margaret blinked. What? 6 months ago, sold it to a larger firm, made a substantial amount of money, retired. He paused. Married again to Jessica. You probably don't know her. Margaret felt a strange mix of emotions. Some relief that he'd apparently moved on, some indignation that he was telling her this, some curiosity about where this was going. Congratulations, she said, because it seemed like the appropriate response. I've been thinking about a lot of things, Richard continued. About the divorce, about how I handled it, about how I handled you. He looked up from his coffee. I followed what you did with the pool. I read the articles in the neighborhood paper. I know about the nonprofit. I know about how you built something. Why are you telling me this? Margaret asked. Because I was wrong, Richard said, and the words seemed to cost him something. Not just about the lawsuit, though I was wrong about that too, but about everything. About how I treated you. About assuming you were doing things out of spite when you were actually doing them out of principle. I couldn't understand that because I don't think that way. I was projecting. Margaret set down her coffee very carefully. Richard. I want to increase Emma's trust fund, he continued, and now Margaret understood where this was heading. And I want to stop the alimony, not because you did anything wrong, you didn't, but because I don't think you ever needed my money. I think you proved that pretty thoroughly. You're doing this because you feel guilty, Margaret said. Yes, Richard agreed. But that doesn't make it wrong. Guilt can be a productive emotion. It can prompt you to correct course. They sat in silence for a while. Margaret understood in that moment that Richard was doing what humans sometimes did at the end of their lives, or at the end of their chapters, which was what retirement was. He was taking inventory and trying to balance ledgers. It didn't change what had happened. It didn't erase the hurt or the conflict, but it was something. It was acknowledgement. The pool situation, Margaret said carefully. That wasn't about me being vindictive or calculating. I was angry, yes. But I was also creating a space for myself where I could be someone other than your ex-wife. The nonprofit structure that was about building something that would outlast my anger. I know, Richard said. I get that now. Jessica's a therapist. She helped me understand some things about myself, about why I needed to fight you even after the divorce was settled. And why was that? Margaret asked, genuinely curious. Because you were becoming someone I couldn't predict, Richard said simply. Someone with power that didn't come from me. That scared me. So I tried to reduce you back to the person I understood, the woman fighting for money, fighting for vindication, that I could control. But when I did that, I was small, and I didn't like who I became when I was fighting you. Margaret listened to this confession from her ex-husband, a man she'd spent 15 years loving, then 5 years hating, then a few years simply being indifferent toward, and felt the last weight of their conflict finally lift. I don't want your money, she said. I want you to understand that what I did was good, that I didn't do it to hurt you, that I hope you're genuinely happy with Jessica. I am, Richard said, and I understand. I think I'm finally understanding a lot of things. They parted as people who'd known each other extremely well and would probably never know each other again. It was the right distance. Emma, when Margaret told her, took it in stride. Dad's doing therapy work, Emma said. He and Jessica are apparently in couples therapy stuff. He told me he'd been emotionally rigid his whole life. How do you feel about that? Margaret asked. I think it's good, Emma said. He wasn't happy. He's still not super happy, but he's trying. That's more than I expected from him, honestly. By the following spring, Margaret had officially stepped off the nonprofit board. She remained an advisory member, but day-to-day governance was entirely in Susan and Tom's hands. The pool was thriving. The community programming had expanded. There were waiting lists for the swim lessons. The initial victory of forcing the HOA to acknowledge the pool as community property had transformed into something neither Margaret nor anyone else could have predicted. A legitimate community resource that served dozens of families. But more importantly, Margaret had transformed. The woman who'd been so angry at the world, so determined to prove something, had gradually transformed into someone at peace with her own power. Someone who could exercise influence without needing to demonstrate dominance. She and James had moved in together in a small house with its own garden. She'd taken on the Parks and Recreation Advisory role full-time as a volunteer consultant. She was actually writing, a memoir about the first few years after her divorce, about finding power in unexpected places. She was living, and one afternoon in May, standing in her garden, watering the tomato plants she'd planted in March, she realized something important. She'd won the fight with the HOA. She'd won the fight with Richard. She'd won the fight with herself about whether she was capable of standing alone. But the victory hadn't been the pool. The pool was just the vehicle. The victory was becoming someone who could fight, and then someone who could stop fighting, and then someone who understood the difference between the two. The final beat came not with fanfare, but with simplicity. On the 5-year anniversary of the first permit being sold, Margaret received a letter from Gerald Hutchins, not his lawyer, Gerald himself in his own handwriting on his personal stationery. Margaret, I'll be brief. I was wrong about you, about the pool, about how I handled the situation. I saw you as a threat, and instead of listening or understanding, I fought. I spent 5 years of my life angry at you before finally admitting that I was angry at myself for being outmaneuvered by someone smarter than me. I'm no longer on the HOA board. I resigned last year. I'm watching what you've built and it's good. It's genuinely good. I don't expect forgiveness. But I wanted you to know that I see it, that I understand what you've done. Gerald. Margaret read the letter 3 times. Then she filed it in a drawer. She didn't respond. She understood that Gerald didn't expect a response. He'd written it for his own reasons, his own reckoning. That evening, she sat in the garden with James and showed him the letter. "Do you feel vindicated?" he asked. "No," Margaret said, and she was surprised to realize it was true. "I feel acknowledged, like the truth of what happened is finally being confirmed by people who didn't want to see it for a long time. But vindication implies that I needed their confirmation. I don't anymore." She was quiet for a moment, watching the sun settle toward the horizon, turning the sky into shades of pink and gold. "I was so angry for so long," she said. "And the anger was productive. It made me do things I wouldn't have done otherwise. But at some point, the anger became unnecessary, and I'm glad I was able to put it down before it calcified into something permanent." James squeezed her hand. "You turned spite into community," he said. "That's an unusual alchemy." "I turned spite into a space where other people could build community," Margaret corrected. "That's the distinction I had to learn. I didn't build it alone. I was just the catalyst." Pine Ridge Community Pools had expanded to include 2 facilities. The original pool at Margaret's property, which she'd eventually deeded entirely to the nonprofit, a gesture that surprised everyone including herself, and a second facility built on common ground, funded partially by HOA commitment, partially by continued nonprofit fundraising. The nonprofit's annual budget had grown to $300,000. They served approximately 2,000 residents and community members across the year. They offered scholarships for children whose families couldn't afford membership. They ran competitive swimming programs and recreational leagues. The HOA board had cycled through several presidents. Tom Blackwell had served 2 terms and declined to run again, citing his own need to reduce his commitments. The board and the nonprofit now had a formal partnership agreement, with protocols for communication and shared decision-making. Margaret appeared at the facilities occasionally, to volunteer at fundraising events, to sit on the advisory committee, to mentor younger people who were trying to build community resources. But her life was no longer defined by the pool. She was writing her 3rd book. She and James had started exploring possibilities for child adoption. She'd begun consulting with other communities about how to legitimize recreational facilities and build nonprofit structures. Her life 5 years after the initial conflict began looked nothing like the life she'd been living. It was slower. It was deeper. It was built on collaboration rather than defiance. but she didn't regret the defiance, the anger, the willingness to stand alone and say, "No, this is mine, and I will not surrender it." Because without that, she never would have discovered what she was capable of, and she wouldn't be the woman she'd become. Richard, meanwhile, had genuinely transformed. He and Jessica had 2 children together. He'd started volunteering with at-risk youth, using his business skills to teach them about entrepreneurship. He saw Emma regularly. He and Margaret had evolved into something that resembled friendship, or at least a respectful understanding. The HOA, despite its earlier opposition, had become a case study in conflict resolution. Urban planners from other cities reached out to ask about how Pine Ridge had managed to transform conflict between residents and governance into collaborative resource building. The pool, in the end, had become what Margaret suspected it always could have been. Not a battleground, but a gathering place. A place where community was built not through enforcement, but through genuine care for shared space. One summer afternoon, as she sat poolside watching a class of 6-year-olds learn to swim, children of people who'd been too poor to afford pools, children of neighborhood residents who'd grown up swimming, children of families newly arrived in the area learning that this community had a resource they could access, Margaret understood that the victory wasn't about the pool. It was about discovering that she had the power to create. It was about learning that power didn't require anyone else's permission. It was about becoming the kind of woman who could stand in defiance and then choose collaboration on her own terms. And as the sun warmed her shoulders and the sounds of children laughing filled the air, Margaret closed her eyes and felt something she'd spent most of her life searching for. Peace. Not the absence of struggle, but the knowledge that she could survive struggle and emerge stronger. Not the absence of anger, but the wisdom to know when to put it down. Not victory over others, but victory over herself.